Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Em, and we have a ridiculous number of spoilers to go through today. Not only are there a bunch of new community spoilers, as well as a new mechanic breakdown, although it's basically just about heroes. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. But we also have a bunch of new cards that are in the client as a result of the preview event going live. So there's going to be a lot of different cards to discuss. I think what we're going to do is we're going to break it down between the community spoilers and the cards that are in the client right now, and we'll probably have this in two videos. But for now, first things first, let's review all of the cards that have been spoiled in the community spoilers section. So we're just going to go alphabetical and start running through them. There's a lot of interesting stuff, and starting with Ashara, Widowmaker, a 3/3 charge quick draw elf gunslinger, two relevant tribal types. Contract 2, deal 3 damage to another unit. Its owner gains 3 health and draws a card. So notably, you can heal yourself by having Ashara shoot somebody else, one of your larger units, and get an extra card out of that, and basically make it so that Ashara is therefore providing you with card advantage. Or you can shoot your opponent's units, get extra tempo on the board, but your opponent gets to replace that card with a card, and then of course they do have the extra 3 health, which will probably be going away because Ashara has charge and will be coming in with quick draw on top of that. This is a stat-efficient unit with a reasonable contract that being entirely optional makes a significant difference to. I think that a 3/3 charge quick draw is just a pretty powerful card overall. You get a good amount of different stats here. The Xenon archetype combined with the double influence of both types at 3 means this card is actually not going to see play at 3 quite as often as you would like. It really depends on what type of hybrid power we see in this particular set. Like Felon paintings and stuff do help quite a bit, or Xenon paintings, if there are a Xenon painting. I don't think there is. But yeah, unless you have a decent amount of undepleted hybrid power to play down these cards, Ashara Widowmaker is not a reliable aggro tool due to the fact that they're just not going to be attacking at 3 as often as you would like. Although being able to just jump down, attack at 3, and be fairly hard to block, combined with the ability to get +4 attack off of a 1-cost card in this set, there's a fast spell that just gives them that ability. Ashara trades really well with a lot of different things, and should be good in most Xenon archetypes due to the fact that attack boosters allow her to run in and do a lot of damage. I think that the ability to deal damage on summon is still a really powerful card, even if it is giving your opponent a beneficial effect. And the ability to play this as a potential, like, draw your own card option is also just decent, strong value. So yeah, this seems like a really interesting hero with a lot of different tools and uses. I would say that she's high on the power level scale without ever being completely broken. The replace effect is really good for your opponent. The draw effect is fairly good for you, but has its own drawbacks. Everything that she does has like a little bit of interplay and interesting interaction. This is one of the most unique cards to be put down that I've seen so far out of all the ones that we've been seeing. It definitely makes a very different change to the board presence that you wouldn't normally see on a Game of Eternal. So that's a really good design. I think it's very cool, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays. Sensari Firebrand, 3/1 Valor, contract 2, deal 3 damage to each player. So this card has Valor, which means that Valor is coming back as a keyword. When it attacks, it gets +1/+1 for each card that's blocking it. And it also has the ability to deal extra damage provided you're paying a contract, which has some potential in aggro decks that just want to go very hard for face. I would say this is an expensive contract for that particular ability, but because it is direct damage to the face, and red is just going to be apparently really reaching for a lot of that direct burn, this is something that could potentially be very good. I think that life gain in this set is going to be more important than in other sets due to the fact that there are so many red cards that are specifically just damage to the player, relatively efficient cost, and go. So like a lot of the Stones card deck is going to be about burning you down before you can do other things, and a lot of other decks might end up actually including some life gain just to prevent those cards from being especially beneficial. So any cards where you play a card and you get additional life gain, you continue to maintain card advantage, but you actually get the bonuses, those cards are going to be stronger as a result of so many of these Stonescar cards being printed where they're just like extra damage, crazy times. So important to note. All right, Kuno, the chronomancer. I'm going to try a thing here to... There we go. not have to constantly resize. 5 cost 4/4 ambush. Contract 3, put a card from your void on top of your deck. So this is a 4/4 with ambush, which overall not bad for this particular stat line. I think 5 cost 4/4 is about the minimum amount of stats that you want out of a unit like this, but it does allow you to basically just mess with a bunch of different aggro units, and it gives you an interesting trick, which is also pretty decent. The contract is put a card from your void on top of your deck. I do like that this card actually manages to sort of artistically display a character who is going backwards in time. He definitely doesn't appear to be like, yeah, I think it kind of has that thing going on where he just kind of seems to be stepping backwards into the portal, while also I don't know how they did that. That's a really good like sort of artistic expression. It also could be that they're just going for a graceful bow, but I think it's a little bit of a mix of both, and that's kind of a neat piece of art in that respect. The art in this set has been really really good so far. I'm actually very excited for all of the interesting things that are happening there. It's just a lot of fun cards with really fun personality. So happy with those. The contract, put a card from your void on top of your deck, is reasonable. It's an excavate, and paying 3 for an excavate is still good. I think that you get a decent amount of benefit out of that. Overall, the card's not very stat efficient, but it is a really interesting option for a time deck that wants to play a wide variety of different cool things and can allow you to get back into some warp shenanigans if you're really, really excited about that. Definitely some possibilities here. Not sure if it's going to be an insanely strong card because everything about it is just a little underpowered, but it definitely has a good amount of value associated with it, even though it is not a card advantage card. And repeatability of spells can be a very powerful effect in time, mid-range, and control, so that's important to note. All right, next up we got Dardamus Iceblade, a hero Yeti. The other units in your deck the other units in play have +1 health, which actually that's a really, really decent effect. That's not an effect that I think is currently printed on any other cards, and it basically just means that a lot more units are significantly less vulnerable to other things, including your Yetis. So makes it harder to lightning storm your Yetis, makes it harder to hailstorm your Yetis, makes it harder to do 1 damage to all your Yetis with any sort of interesting effect like that. Basically just makes it harder to clear the board of a lot of Yetis, and you also get a contract of inferiority complex, which I believe forces an enemy to attack every turn. Another decent-ish contract. I think the current contract like average cost is 2 higher than what you would expect out of the card that would normally be played. Inferiority complex is not a card that you would play for a significant amount of like money, but it might be something that you'd give to something for like a single power. So this is average aggro. I think that the disabling of a blocker is pretty interesting, but 2 attack does really sort of damage it a little bit. I think it's very important that the card has 3 health, since it is giving other things more health so that they don't have 2 health, and that is something where like if this card were more vulnerable, that would be a real big problem. But here it's actually like relatively stat efficient and like okay at being defensive, but I'm uncertain if it's going to fit into any Yeti decks for like a major purpose beyond just being a draft card. Deja Vu. Ooh, this one's fun. Put one of your units into your hand. This costs 0. The unit costs 0 and has ambush this turn. So this is pay 4 to repeat any unit that you want. You get to heal the unit if it's damaged and then place it down again. You get to retrigger summon effects. You get to retrigger any sort of other effects that might occur, like mastery or anything along those lines that resets. Eternal has just a ton of different effects that reset on the card being played, including ultimates and other things like that. So Deja Vu allows you to replay ultimates and a lot of other things. It is also a combat trick. It is also a protect. So all of those things means that it's a really, really versatile card that actually has a lot of power associated with it, depending on how strong your summon effects are. If your opponent just needs to get rid of one of your big cards, say like a Jack the Lone Gun that's attacking, then you can bounce this thing back into hand, and then later on you can ambush it, which if it's on your turn, that's totally fine. Saving a card from a fast spell is really, really strong. If it's not on your turn, you can attack with something, and when they attack back, you can Deja Vu this, bounce the card to your hand, and then play it. And that also has a lot of good benefits. This card has really interesting applications on both sides of the turn, and it has different applications depending on whose turn it is, and so that leads to some really interesting gameplay. I think it's a cool, versatile card that actually like is as powerful as it looks. It's actually very, very strong, and good summon effects will determine the strength of it in Expedition, but in Throne, this is actually a card that's going to see some play because this just allows you to repeat so many interesting effects for so many different benefits. Very, very cool stuff. and a hell of a combat trick. Okay, draconic looting. So sort of like a different take on faithless looting, I guess. Draconic looting, looting, if you don't know, is a term for hello, fit to screen. There we go. Looting is a term for when you are drawing cards, but you have to discard them, discard cards after. So like draw 2, discard 2. I think it's discard 2, draw 2 is generally the loot, something like that. Draconic looting says draw 3 cards. You have to discard them at the end of turn. So any cards that you draw, you have to play. Notably, this card can also be inscribed to give you additional power, meaning that if you're playing draconic looting, you're probably getting into some very, very big cards pretty easily. But you can also pick up power with this card, which is really, really strong, I would say. Pay 3, draw a power card, draw another card that you can play them both. That's all you need out of this card for this card to be good. And if you're playing a decent amount of like small, relatively aggressive creatures, draconic looting can really, really get you there on that front. If you're just looking for your 4th or 5th power, I mean, paying 3 for a 5th power is really not that bad. And the card that you're playing is undepleted, so you're at least going to be able to use that for other things as well. Seems like a really, really solid red draw card. It's not disgustingly strong by any means. It's very unreliable, but it does provide you with a lot of the things that you really, really want out of a card like this. And so I'm pretty happy with it overall. This seems like a good design and should be very, very strong for the red decks that are just constantly seeking for ways to pressure your opponent out. I'm sensing a pretty strong theme in red here that actually just seems to be coming through in just every common and every uncommon that we've seen spoiled so far, and that is really, really neat to see. All right, only the beginning. So this is an inscribe for 4, and it reads... pay 4, inscribe, but you can also play 3 units from your void that died this turn. So 2 different options here. One is that you actually get to save a bunch of units that died, which is very, very good, particularly against like a harsh rule or something like that. Playing this against a harsh rule is probably game over for a control deck. It's just absolutely disgusting. The units aren't exhausted, which is really notable. So if you're playing this with like a bunch of killer units or things that are created that have killer, I think there are a couple of cards that specifically create a bunch of killer units all at once. So you could do stuff like only at the beginning, back your like wisp pile or something along those lines. But if you just make a big attack, trade a bunch of cards, and then only the beginning, that's also really good. Traditionally, cards like this are not typically strong because A, they typically only target 1 unit, B, they tend to be overcosted for the amount of units and stats that they are getting back, and C, they don't have an alternate use. Only the beginning fixes all of these options. So if you don't have to actually get the opportunity to pay for something that's going to like counter out a harsh rule, if you just don't have that power up at the appropriate times, you can still play this card as a depleted power. And that means that this card is actually really strong in that particular respect, and it fixes your power in general, which is always nice. I think this card's really, really good. It seems like the best of the temporary resurrections that we've seen so far, and a pretty strong card overall. Dela Free Profit. All right. Look at this guy first. I'm so glad that this loaded at exactly that art ratio, because that is excellent. Just love him. Isn't he great? Like, now that he's finally out, he's out of his captivity. Delph has been typically portrayed in like a straitjacket. He just seems so happy. He's gorging himself on fruit. It's wonderful. Anyways, he dies. 3 costs 3/1, unblockable. When a player plays a spell directly on Delph, you sacrifice him, and then you get to invoke Xenon, which I don't know if that means that you can invoke a card from either of the 2 colors, or if you specifically invoke from 3 different choices of a Xenon card. But Discovery is super fun, and if it's limited to just the pool of Xenon cards, that's a really good set of cards that you're getting. 3 costs 3/1, unblockable. Good stat line, very, very solid for aggressive options, and since the card specifically gets a benefit if anyone plays a spell on him, that means that he gets to attack pretty freely, and your opponent will basically have to use something to trade into him that will instead actually cause you to draw another card of your choice, which could be even more powerful for your next setup. This is a good card. Really, really strong Xenon option that just flavorful as heck, and I'm very, very happy to see Delph happy, even if it is clearly extremely temporary. But what a good card. What a good card. Yeah, really, really like that one. So, very, very good stuff. Okay. Next up, we have Forestall. Prevent all damage to an enemy of your choice would deal this turn and draw a card. So this is an effect that we've seen printed before. It's fine. At 3, this is pretty expensive, but because the card cantrips itself, it is a little bit stronger. Interesting to see Talir back in like red-haired land. It looks like the blonde Super Saiyan thing has sort of worn off, at least. I don't know. I think the depiction of her is a little bit inconsistent in that respect, but it's cool to see her in front of the throne just sort of talking people away, and we'll see if there's going to be some more Talir stuff in the art in the future. This card overall is not like insanely powerful, but it is a good little combat trick and draft that also doesn't cost you a card. That means that you're probably going to pick it fairly highly in draft just because it's going to be so easy to make this into good trades with good effects for other options. It does specifically say an enemy of your choice, so you can actually prevent the damage that, say, your opponent is trying to deal with a red spell of some kind, which is pretty reasonable. There's some good stuff there, but by and large, it's not a especially exciting card in most respects other than just being a cantripping, pretty interesting draft combat trick. All right, Godan Coldheart. This is another contract card. It's a 6 cost and 5/5 endurance quick draw. Contract 2, discard your card and draw 3 cards. You get to deal 2 damage to the enemy player for each spell discarded this way. So when you pay 6 for this card, contract 2 is really not that expensive of an additional cost. Very likely to be something that you could afford to pay for, since 6 is typically going to be at the top of your curve, and you're probably not going to be looking for another 6 drop in Recano. That seems very unlikely. Once you play this card, you do have the contract paid, but you actually get to draw 3 additional cards. So if you have a hand that's completely empty, you get to refill your hand. If you don't have a hand that's completely empty, you can discard a number of different spells to deal direct damage to your opponent. And there are a lot of different ways that could potentially lead into a Godan combo deck or lead into a Godan aggro mid-range deck, where the goal is not to draw the 3 cards, but just to discard a bunch of spells. And spell aggro Godan seems like something that could be very, very interesting in that respect. Oni Gunslinger is always an interesting stat line. I think there are just like way too many Oni Gunslinger at this point. It's supposed to be very, very rare, I believe, Oni or Gunslinger, but we have a ton of them now. So I guess they're really sort of developing their style. This is a really cool card. I think it's good design for a hero and pretty exciting if they ever do a hero mode. I would say that the hero article that came out yesterday was not indicating that that's something that's going to be happening this set, but it might be something that we could see later on. And I'm sure that in events, this card will be a cool hero to sort of lead the charge, which is pretty neat stuff. All right, Gravaturgist, a 1/4 flying endurance, which, yeah, that's a traditional stat line. We've seen some cards that can do some pretty wild stuff in these particular stats. As contract 3, you have +3 strength and charge just this turn. I'm not sure. This one's always a little weird on the wording. It's hard to say if the +3 strength is permanent or if it's just temporary. I would think either way, this is not a contract that you're super happy to play, nor a card that you're super happy to play. In draft, it's decently strong because flying endurance 1/4s just like kind of rule the landscape. They're just like, if you have enough health, you can block and attack efficiently, deal a bunch of extra damage, and the contract helps you to get a bit more damage across. But that being said, this card's stats are pretty bad. A 4-cost 1/5 is more likely to actually be a card that sticks on the board and helps you, whereas 1/4 flying endurance, like, I actually think is worse. It's just too easy to kill, too easy to trade with. You don't get to block with it nearly as often, which is one of its primary purposes, is defying other flyers. And then the one attack on it means that like using the endurance doesn't really happen as much because it just doesn't swing as much. Still, it's a good weapon carrier. Any sort of buffs on this card are going to be pretty sick, and so in draft formats, this could be a card that gets a little bit more benefit. But the endurance is almost useless when the health is so low for its cost and the attack is so low for its cost. Both of those things are just better on cards that have better stats. All right, Yadria, the Brewer. Okay, whoop, whoop, whoop. Yadria, Yadria Twisted Brewer. 4 double blue, double purple, 3/4. When an enemy attacks, its health becomes 1. When an enemy blocks, its strength becomes 1. This is a permanent effect. So this card is disgusting. There's a lot of really good things happening here. This is basically like a fog effect in some effect, where the card just permanently sits on the board and makes it so that they just don't really get to attack or block nearly as often as they would like. They can't trait effectively because if they block, their strength becomes 1, which means that, you know, yadria itself is not going to get blocked very often. And if they attack, then their units become glass cannons that you can very, very easily clear with any number of fast reaction spells, Storm Spiral, something along those lines. This is a really, really interesting take on the Feln Witch, and I think it's a really, really powerful card overall for its stat line. The one notable thing about it is that the card does not have any sort of immediate onboard impact, and it is somewhat low statted, so it's possible that if the card just sees removal pretty consistently, that it's not going to be a very, very powerful option. But basically, this card buys you so much time if it can't be removed, because it makes it so that all of your trades are really good and your attacks are really, really good. Both offense and defense are really, really solid here, and because of that, I think the card's reasonably solid. Double blue, double purple at 4 is a little tricky, but pretty within the realm of possibility, and overall this card seems like something that's definitely going to be popping down in addition to a bunch of other aggro stuff, or potentially even in like a control deck where you have like a couple of different ways to sort of like Storm Spiral away from enemies and just get into a situation where you're feeling much better after that. Yeah, definitely has a lot of interesting strengths and leads to interesting board states. A lot of the things we're looking for here are just how much fun does this add to Eternal, and this is a card that seems super fun to have down. Final Balance. Oh boy, this one's interesting. So this one's 5 cost. It's 5 green for 5 cost, so it's not necessarily going to be played at a harsh rule level. If there's an even number of units, they each get double damage until the end of your turn. There's an odd number of units, kill them all. It's a spell, so at least it's not going to be played like on the attack or anything like that, which is the sort of the place that I think is a little bit more unusual. So it's double damage until the end of your next turn, notably, which is, I think this card might be bad. It's pretty cool if you're trying to get double damage. I think that, like, most of the time well, I don't know. So here's the thing. Your opponent controls what happens with this card pretty frequently. If they are not in any way, like, if they have any power available at all, there's a number of different difficult tricks that can happen here that cause you to have very serious problems as a result. For example, you have a board where there's just too many units on it, and they're all your opponents. You play Final Balance because there's an odd number of units in play. Your opponent devours a card in response. All of their units now have double damage. You are dead. You have a bunch of units that you want to attack with that want double damage. You play Final Balance to try and give all of those units double damage. Your opponent annihilates one of your units, and your board advantage evaporates. You are probably dead. This card is significantly too controlled by your opponent. It has way too much of an influence cost. It is not too expensive, but it is definitely a slow spell that your opponent gets to control the reaction to that will very, very frequently hurt you. I also kind of love it. It's fun. Yeah, this is a cool card. It's definitely not a powerful card, but it's definitely one of the more interesting and flashy legendaries in the set. I would also say it's one of the biggest traps in the set. Super, super cool card, though. Very, very good design on the harsh rule. I like the variation. I think that the 5 and 5 is very cool. It's a very pleasing card. It is not a card that's going to necessarily lead you to have a good time. But if you do give double damage to all your units, and if you do kill all of your opponent's other units, both those things are great things to do. So keep it in mind. All right, Zoltan Ambassador. Always glad to see more Yetis, and there are just a ton of them. Really, we've been missing out on Yetis. They haven't been in a lot of the recent sets, and they're one of Eternal's big strengths, I think. 2 cost 1/1, when you play a hero, draw a card. So Heroes Matter Yeti with a small, decent stat line. Heroes Matter is going to be a consistent theme over this set. This is an okay version of that card that I think performs pretty well in most limited formats and can potentially be a deck build around in some forms of hero-based decks in blue. It's overall nothing special or nothing too heavy to remark on, but it does have some interesting aspects to it. A tall Yeti in a robe is interesting. I'm very curious. There's not a lot of comedy there, but it is kind of an interesting little card. I don't have a major comment on this one apart from that it is a good Heroes Matter card, and that is something that definitely works out, and it's clearly not overpowered or necessarily underpowered. Okay, Inferno Phoenix. So Always glad to see more giant flaming chickens as a Pojo myself for the time being. We are very, very happy to see more of these guys. Okay, so this is a 5-cost 3/1 flying charge double damage. Entomb, flying charge, and double damage are randomly distributed to the top 3 units of your deck. Those are all good stat lines. You get 1 for each of those units. They are pretty decent things to be put on different things, and notably the randomness can probably be controlled, i.e. if you have a bunch of flying and charge units, they will all get double damage, or like, well, one of them will get double damage. I actually think you might not be able to trigger double damage 3 times. Definitely not, in fact. So if you have like units that already have flying, they're more likely to get charged and double damage. If you have units that already have charge, same thing, but you also might lose some of the impact from the Entomb as a result. This card has very, very low stats. It does deal 6 damage when it's played, which is pretty significant, but it is also very, very easy to kill. And the flying charge double damage Entomb, on the other hand, means that it being easy to kill isn't necessarily the end of the world here. I think overall this card provides, again, a lot of reach to the red deck, but it's maybe one of the more unnecessary ways to get that extra bit of damage in. For red mid-range, got some real potential. Really, really is very, very good with all types of Stone Scar Resurrection, because the more that you are bringing this card back, if you are dark returning this, for example, it just comes back, plays for 5, and then deals 8 to your opponent, which is absolutely disgusting. Haunting, Screaming, these types of things can be like really, really ridiculous. Not that this card is Haunting Screamable, but any type of repeat effect that continues to bring this card back is going to be very, very big. And there are a couple of different versions of that in the format, which should definitely be pretty interesting to see. So yeah, the card has a lot of potential as a build around me. It's not inherently powerful by itself. Inseparable. Okay. This is one of the hero benefits cards. Draw 2 units from your void. Each hero this way gets +2/+2. It's Grasping at Shadows, except that you don't get to play the unit, so it's actually just a really, really expensive draw 2. That also gives you a small stat bonus to hit heroes. This seems like a fine limited card. It's not particularly strong for anything else. Overall, it's an okay card, but I wouldn't say it's doing anything particularly special with the Heroes Matter options beyond just making your heroes a little bit bigger. I do think the card has a decent amount of value and could potentially be played in certain expedition decks, but very expensive for that type of effect, so maybe not. Cons, Sensare General. 5/5 Inscribe, or 7/5 Inscribe, for 7. 4 red influence, and when you inscribe it, the top unit or weapon of your deck gets +1 strength, which that's a pretty reasonable use of an inscribe. A depleted power that gives the top unit or weapon of your deck +1 strength is all right. That's not a terrible, terrible thing to have. The other ability, your units and weapons have +2 strength, is okay. At 7, this is basically like a General Azaleo type effect, and General Azaleo has quick draw, although 1 less stat in both particular levels. This card has a really, really deep red cost, which is a bit of an issue. I think the Inscribe is really what you're playing it for. If you're playing it for the other option, then you're going to get a mild rally effect that helps out your flyers, but that's not a game-winning proposition, and it's not what you want on a 7-drop. Overall, it's still something that you're going to be pretty happy with to see in a sealed format or a draft format, and it's something that could be really, really good in certain red decks that want to build around that top unit or weapon ability and just like do some pseudo war cries with their power while they're doing some actual war cries with their other war cries. So pretty interesting stuff. All right, let's try Pathfinder. The previous version of this card was a 2/1 for 2 that said draw a card, discard a card. Pathfinder is a 2/1 for 1 that has contract 2, draw a card, and discard a card. So 1 more than you would normally pay for this effect, but you do pay it in installments, meaning that you're basically paying for a little early access to that card. 1 cost for a 2/1 is pretty reasonable for a blue aggro deck, and it's also an elf, which is relevant for that particular subtype. Aren't that many good aggressive elves? I think there are actually plenty of good aggressive elves, but this is a decent option in blue that doesn't usually have... blue does not usually have access to 2/1s at 1. I think this is a pretty interesting place for this particular card's cost. The draw discard option is very, very good and allows you to consistently fix your power. The main thing is that you're skipping your turn 2, which... maybe you want to do that, maybe you don't. At the very least, you can trigger a lot of interesting discard and looting effects and get a lot of value out of that. I think the card's contract is pretty fair. I think the card's cost is pretty fair. I think the main thing that's remarkable about this card is actually its stat line and the fact that it's a 2/1 in blue at 1, which is not something that you see very often. All right. Lost in Thought. Inscribe for 2. Put a unit with cost 4 or less into its owner's hand. Pretty reasonable fast spell. Just a little bounce for 2 that doesn't do too much one way or the other. Kind of neat, but like mostly just interesting for its inscribe aspect, and having some removal that is also inscribe is, I think, a reasonable way to get away from certain aggro decks and help yourself out a little bit against those decks, forcing them to replay their cards while you set up and build more power, build more card draws so that you can get into your mid-range. That's going to be relatively important against certain Stonescar decks. I can see this as an Expedition card. It's definitely a strong draft card because Inscribe is just a card that you... Inscribe is something you're going to be picking very, very frequently and limited because fixing your power is super key. Pull from duty. Put one of your units. Wah! That's not the way to fit to screen. There we go. 3 costs, put one of your units into your hand and give it +1/+1. Invoke Combre. So there's an invoke for probably every single one of the factions that's going to be in this particular setup. I don't remember which of the pairings there are so far, but I think it's Combre, Ricano, Stonescar, and Xenon. Sounds right. So yeah, there's a decent amount of interesting options here. Put one of your units in your hand and give it +1/+1 is a decent benefit. It's basically a safe return, except it's way more expensive. But the card also invokes, which is very, very good and something you might actually want to see on a safe return. The main issue with this is that oftentimes when you're invoking, you're trying to plan ahead. Pull from Duty is a card that is reactive and therefore does not plan ahead at all. It gives you 2 cards worth of advantage, but you lose all of your board presence in the process. So as a way to repeat summon effects, this is the second card in time that does this. So play a really powerful card, play Pull from Duty, and play the 4 cost that bounces it as well. You've got a bunch of different options to just constantly repeat killer effects and repeat summon effects in time. That's a really, really strong thing to be having in this set and could lead to some really, really cool decks that play around with repeated effects off of summons and other types of effects like that. So kind of interesting. Okay as a trick, but a little bit expensive. The Invoke is what adds so much power to this card, because Invoke is just better than a card draw in most instances. Realize your potential. All right, transform. And by that I'm saying that I'm fitting this thing to the screen. Realize your potential gives a unit Aegis, and its strength and health becomes higher of the 2. Okay, kind of a neat little option here. So you get to basically buff up any one unit while also giving it Aegis. This works really well on cards that have very uneven stat lines. I can't think of any right off the top of my head that are currently in this set that are going to be really, really powerful. But that Shard of the Spire effect I think is better on a fast spell than it is on a relic. And I think giving Aegis to the card in addition to that is a really, really good benefit that should be pretty cool to see. I think this is best as a combat trick on defense when your opponent is attacking into one of your like 0/7 walls. Blocking, then giving the unit Aegis so that the strength and health becomes 7/7 means you now have a 7/7 Aegis monster. You just killed one of your opponent's big units, and that monster can't be killed by spells easily, meaning you are just in a much better position as a result of that. So seems like a pretty decent trick. Definitely good in Draft Expedition, all of that. Could even be good in certain Throne decks that want to play with that Shard of the Spire sort of level of options. Shift Zone Sniper, 1/1 weapon with a summon, draw a card. Repeatable, simple, not very efficient, mostly draft chaff, but overall, like, it's okay. I don't like the art on this one that much. It barely looks like a sniper rifle. But beyond that, I think that it is just a markedly average card that should be very, very powerful in limited formats. So good stuff there. Okay, this is Rocket Sled. Rocket Sled is not a card that you can actually play, but it is a 3 cost that says your spells deal +1 damage and your Yeti have +1 strength. And I believe the next card will be the one that plays that. Yep, Torque Ballistics Crafter. All right, 3 cost, 3/3, ultimate at the start of your turn. You can discard 2 cards to play said Rocket Sled, and it also has contract 1, create and draw a snowball. So on 3, you play this card, you get yourself a snowball, which is fairly cheap, and you'll be able to play it next turn even with your contract because you have 3 power available. And then at the start of your turn, if you are excited about it, you can play a Rocket Sled to boost that snowball to 2 damage and make Torgue Ballistics Crafter a 4/3. That is a lot of discards, so you really better have some kind of discard synergy ready here, or at least just a really, really powerful Yeti system going. The nice thing about this is that you don't discard the cards to play the Rocket Sled until it is relevant, which is to say your next attack. If you're playing aggro Yetis, you play Torg Ballistics Crafter, you pay for the contract, and now you have the threat of a Yeti rally combined with a 2 damage burn spell on your turn 4, which is fairly good if you want to just be rushing through your opponents and dealing a ton of damage. I think, this might be something that you could reasonably play with like Champion of Furies and Throne and do some like pretty wild stuff with Yeti aggro. The discard 2 cards is a significant drawback, so you have to be very, very aware that if you are making this decision to actually discard the 2 cards, there is the potential that your opponent has something lying in wait, and that's going to be basically whether or not your opponent has open power or has a good blocker or something along those lines. But if your opponent doesn't have open power and you already have a good aggro setup, discarding the 2 cards to play the Rocket Sled is likely to win you the game or get you fairly close to it. So, yeah. Overall, reasonably powerful Skycrag option, combined with all of the red burned face spells. I think Yeti aggro has a real chance of being very, very good again, but that may not have been in any doubt when it was announced that we were returned to Myria. Yeti aggro is just kind of a constant in life. This is a very interesting Yeti aggro card. Really just top-notch design on all of these cards. Very, very happy with that. All right, Victimous Crime. This might be the card I hate the most out of all of the current designs that we've talked about. 2-cost fast spell, kills a non-hero unit. Yeah, it's like an Annihilate, except it's really more like the one that kills the hybrid units. The ones where it's like you're killing only the units that maybe aren't going to be in play as often. With Victimless Crime, there's a lot of encouragement to run really hero-heavy decks, which is something that's going to be very, very common, I think. As a result, Victimless Crime will probably fall off, and heroes are just the more interesting units anyways, so it seems fairly likely that you're not going to see a lot of non-hero units, or at least you're not going to see as many that are going to be really good targets for Victimless Crime. In addition, the big legendary is the place where all of your good value from your shadow cards is particularly effective. Those cards are almost always heroes, so if you want to have that 7/7 Bodhi and Rocks type thing, then Victimless Crime is just not going to affect it. I think this card is significantly less likely to be as good as an Annihilate in this format, and it's likely replacing Annihilate in this format, so overall it's a pretty meh card that also punishes you for playing less interesting decks, which, that's fine, but it's not like a super important thing. Oh, we're missing Bodhi and Rocks Forever. I'll have to go grab that real quick. All right, Bodhi and Rocks Forever, 7-cost 6/6 inscribe. Can't be killed if they're your only unit, and when you inscribe them, you put a copy of them into the top 7 cards of your deck with +2/+2. Very classy art reference going on here. The funny card. I like this one a lot. The inscribe ability is quite good as well. I think you just get to get a decent amount of benefits as a result of it. And the fact is that you are basically just always playing Bodhi and Rocks later in the game when you actually want to, and it's going to be a big, probably a 10/10 unit. This is a really consistent way to get additional power depleted on a consistent schedule. You're always going to have power in the top 7 cards to your deck when you're playing Bodhi and Rocks Forever, and at the end of the time when you no longer need power, you are now playing a 10/10 giant or an 8/8 giant, which is an okay stat line for a middling unit. By and large, this is a cool thing. I think that if there are ways to play infinite amounts of power, things like that, you could get into some unusual combos with the card. Not hugely so, but it's something that does have some mild potential. And the ever-growing giant that plays out entirely from your hand is a fun little secret to have for the entirety of the game until eventually you just slam this guy and give it charge. Really, really fun little trigger off of a Blitzstone or something along those lines. This is a really neat design. I like this one a lot. So let's talk about the last one in the list. We've gone from the A's to the Z's. So let's talk about mild amount of context for this one first. When Deja Cabal Chairman came out, I was pretty consistent in joking about Dezo's house cat, which is in the art for the card. And I think I made some wallpapers and stuff for the cat. I call them Scruffles McFluffington Cabal Chair Cat. They printed that card. Zito Cabal House Cat is Dezo's little kitty, looking very threatening. having revenge and also taking out a contract on you. The enemy player discards a card of their choice from their hands. This is a 1-cost card that forces your opponent to discard immediately, and then can revenge back and do it again later on in the game. Also, fairly hard to kill. Cats have at least 2 lives, so that's nice, and can get destiny and some other cool things. I would say paying 2 to make your opponent discard a card is a reasonable contract at any cost, and a 1-cost 1/1 is a small, neat little kicker for this card overall. It's nice to see the true power behind the throne coming out for a little bit of play, and this seems like a stronger card than Tiso, in fact, in terms of like how many decks that you'll see him in. I think he's a really, really cool little card that actually does just a ton of damage and things like that. This is or not a ton of damage, but does really mess up your opponent's plans quite a bit. Yeah, as a 1/1 that basically forces your opponent to be less heavy on cards, that's pretty interesting. And the one notable thing is that you are playing a pretty minor stat line card to get your opponent to discard a card, so you're not actually card neutral until the card revenges and you pay the contract twice, which paying 4 to make opponent discard 2 cards over the course of contract is still kind of fine. Contract is not necessarily a card where you are, since you aren't paying for the costs immediately, it's not necessarily costing you as much as you would expect, but it's still a question of whether or not you want to pay those contracts or whether you just want to have a 1/1 revenge talk tick type thing where you are just getting some mild benefits from it. Still, a cool little cat, best with any type of sacrifice effects, but if you sacrifice him, I'm sure he will look upon you in judgment, and your games may end up being cursed by the black cat. Regardless, it's super cool card, and a fitting end to this particular round of the spoiler breakdowns. All right, that's it for now. Next, we're going to go into the cards that are in client. That might be today or it might be tomorrow, depending on how much time I have left to record. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you're interested, we are still streaming on Twitch TV. We haven't been able to get into it this week just due to a number of like random life things, but I am still very much getting back to a regular schedule and should be streaming a ton on the 10th when this set finally releases. We're also going to be streaming the preview event and playing a little bit of that, hopefully this weekend. We are also running a secondary channel where we play Arkham Horror. That's Games with M, and it's in the description below. You can also find us on Discord if you want notifications on when our stuff goes live. I finally fixed the YouTube notification bot, so that's a good spot to do it, as well as through Twitter, or of course just subscribing to us on YouTube. All right, that's all the things. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. We'll be back with more spoiler breakdowns. Cheers.